In this week's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to paint with 3 different types of watercolor paper. With so many different paint application methods, brushes and paints, it's no wonder we're confused. So today I'm going to dispel the mystery of watercolor application. So if you want to level up your watercolor and paint with confidence, then stick around. So you can see that I've drawn a simple flower shape on hot pressed, cold pressed and mixed media paper here. And I have line drawing and reference photograph if you'd like to join in, as you can see there, and details of which I'll tell you about a little later on in this tutorial. So I'm just using my everyday paints to paint these, and these are from Mungyo, and I'm just using a permanent red, Scarlet and Opera for the colours. And you can see me applying directly onto the cold pressed paper, wet on dry. This means that I'll be applying the paint straight onto the watercolour paper without adding a watercolour glaze first. So I'm using a number 2 size spotter, and you can see that I'm going right up to the pencil line with a brush, applying the paint, which is a weak and watery wash. And you'll notice the consistency of the paint here is really important. If the paint is too dry, then your paint won't spread, and obviously if it's too wet, you're going to lose some of the pigment. So when I'm using a hot press paper, I'll be honest with you, it isn't my favorite. It's usually the favoured choice for botanical painting, but actually for me, as we work through these demonstrations, I'll explain to you why I really find it difficult to work with. So now we go on to cold press. Now cold press paper has a texture, and traditionally for my kind of work it's not the ideal kind of paper to use because it has bumps, which means that you may not be able to get fine detail. But let me just explain to you why I really love this paper, and I'm going to keep my biases to myself, but you can see I'm applying this again wet on dry and just using a damp brush to blend that paint into the bumpy textured surface there, and I can get a really smooth graduated glaze on this one. So moving on to mixed media paper. Now this, I think, is the ideal sort of solution to painting if you're a beginner to watercolour. Now this, again, working wet on dry, applying the paint directly onto the watercolour paper like this, and you can see the consistency of the paint is exactly the same for all 3 papers. Now the thing with mixed media paper, I think, is that because I don't know, the surface makes the blending really super easy, and although it's smooth, the same as the hot press paper, the difference is night and day. It really does make a huge difference with the mixed media, and hopefully this will come to light and you'll be able to see what I mean as we work through each one in turn. Now I've done the same process on the other petals apart from one where I'm going to show you wet on wet. So starting with the cold press paper, you can see I'm just adding a water glaze to this petal here, and it's important that you let the water sort of settle into the paper a little bit before you drop in the colour like this. If you put the pigment on too quickly, it just sort of floats on the surface of the paper, and if you've done that yourself, you'll know what I mean. So just give it a few minutes to sort of sink into the paper, or depending on how hot it is, maybe a few seconds, but just let it settle into the paper first. Once I've applied this onto the hot press paper, I'm just gently merging it with a brush into the paper like this. So again, the same thing on cold pressed. Now because of the texture of this paper, you'll find that you'll need to add a lot more water than you did if you were using hot pressed paper. So this again is just going to sink into the paper a little bit before I drop that colour in. And this just falls nicely and it blurs really gently into this textured paper. So for me, working both wet and dry on cold press, it's a win-win because it's so super easy to manage. Once again, using that damp brush to merge those colours into the outline of the pencil like this. And finally, we have the mixed media, the same process, dropping in that water onto the pencil line and dropping in the pigment. Now with a mixed media paper, I'll say that you do need to let that paint, the that water sort of drop in and settle for a little while longer, because it just takes a little bit longer to work into the paper because it isn't textured and it isn't 100% cotton. So just be mindful, you don't want to add your pigment too quickly if you're using mixed media paper. So now that the paint is dry on all of these papers that we have here, I'm going to show you how to apply a watercolour glaze on top of every single one using a different colour. So to begin with, once again, we're working on the cold press, the hot press to begin with. This is a Scarlet colour that I'm using here, and you can see the paint has to be completely dry before you apply the paint. And I'm just letting that settle using a damp brush, and with the tip of this number 2 or number 3 size spotter, I'm just wiggling it into the paper like this. Now I find that for the hot press paper, this blending process is very, very tricky for me. Another reason why I'm not super keen on using this particular colour, this particular paper. And I'm going to show you again with the wet on wet technique on the bottom petal. If you're looking at the top petal that I've done that colour glaze on, you can see it's looking quite patchy, and it isn't something that I would be particularly happy painting with. So going on to the hot pressed, so the Arches cold pressed paper here, exactly the same process, but using the damp brush and blending those colours together, for me, even though it's a bumpy texture, is very, very easy. And it gives you the opportunity to blend those colours together far better. It's kind of like a more forgiving paper, if you like. And you can see that it blends really, really nicely into the existing paper just by using that damp brush. And again, if I use the wet on wet technique by applying the plain water glaze over that existing wash, once more you'll see that it glazes really nicely into that paint that's already on that paper. One thing I will point out is if you're working on these different papers, regardless of the one that you choose to work on, once you have your initial wash on the paper, you'll find that the subsequent washes are applied a lot easier because you have that kind of a barrier that stops it from sticking to the paper. So on the mixed media paper, I find that this particular application method, wet on dry, now is very, very easy to blend, that it isn't sticking to the paper as it was when I did it on the cold pressed, and it's far, far more forgiving. So if you want a smooth paper and you're struggling, I would always recommend the mixed media paper. So give it a try. If you are struggling with a smooth paper, just try it and see what you think. So let's go back onto the wet on wet. So we're using the glaze on this one as well. So wetting that paper over that existing wash once it's dry, and this dropping in that orangey red colour on the top. So as you can see, I've completed the process on all of the 3 papers, and now they're completely dry. Now I've purposely left a couple of petals free so that I can show you what I've started to do regarding just applying the paint and creating a little bit of detail, or the beginnings of detail. So we're going in on the hot press paper here, wet on dry again, so I'm applying the paint directly onto the paper. Now at this point, notice that the paint on the palette is slightly thicker in consistency. I've added more pigment and it's dried on the palette a little bit to give a little bit more control, but you can still see how I'm struggling to blend the paint onto the watercolour paper. Now, as you've probably realised, this isn't a full botanical art tutorial this week. We're just doing this as a demonstration to show you how these papers react. And I recommend highly that you watch it all the way through so that you can see how you can use these application methods for yourself and use it on the paper that you prefer. So once again, I've done the hot press paper, the cold press paper, and now we're working on the mixed media. And I'll keep saying it, but I do think the mixed media paper is far better for blending if you want a smooth finish and if you want that, that transition to be really, really flawless. So at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that we have line drawing and a reference photograph if you'd like to join in with this tutorial, and I recommend that you do so that you can see how the paint handles. Now, if you want to access the line drawing and reference photograph, indeed for all of the tutorials that we do here on YouTube, you can join our Facebook group, and I will put a link in the description box underneath this video so you can have access to all the line drawings and the reference photographs, so you can join in. And we are a wonderful community over there, so do consider joining us. So back onto the mixed media here, and you can see that by using just a really damp brush, not wet, it has to be just damp, so I'm patting it on the kitchen towel and just using a really light touch here to blend these colours together. And once again, this mixed media paper makes really light work of blending these colours, and you can see by using the damp brush that I can just lift out some of the pigment relatively easily. I wouldn't be able to do this on the cold press. It would just be too sticky for me in the way that I work. So I'll just show you here applying the slightly thicker mix of the colours at this point. As we build up the layers on watercolour, and if you want a stronger colour, you need obviously to add less water to your pigment, but make sure that it's damp enough to move around on the paper. If it's too dry, it'll stick and you won't be able to get the effect that you want. So on this cold press paper rather, you can see again it's making the work light. It's really easy to do, and if you want to build stronger, darker colours, then I really recommend that you use the cold pressed, because it's far more forgiving and it lets you build up stronger colours than I would say hot press does. So the hot press paper, the smooth paper here, I find if I need to build stronger colours, I can't get the depth of colour that I need without it going a little bit muddy. But again, it's all down to personal preference, and it might just be the way that I apply my paint. But for me, it doesn't work, and I've really I struggle with it a little bit, and I find that when I'm doing my bigger pieces, I've had to restart and use a cold press paper to get the darker tones. But it is down to you, and it's entirely how you work. But you can see here, I'm lifting out the middle veins with a damp brush, and although it is lifting out, I'm finding that I'm having to apply quite a lot of pressure compared to that of the mixed media. But like I said, it's just my opinion. Having completed the glazes on all of these, I'm now going to just do a plain water glaze. Now, if you're familiar with my painting tutorials, you'll know that I do this quite a lot by just applying plain water over the existing dry paint to merge these colours together and take away any hard edges. And I do this on most of my paintings, if not all. And again, they handle very differently, these different papers, finding that the cold press paper is probably the best. So I'm now using a flat synthetic brush here and just dampening it down, patting it on the kitchen towel, and again we're doing some lifting out here on the dry paint. So with a damp brush on dry paint on the hot press paper, you can see that it lifts out relatively easily, but that's because we now have quite a few layers of paint on the paper. So if you're starting at the beginning of your painting and you're trying to lift out your paint, you may find it doesn't lift off as well as if there are more layers, if that makes sense. So the more paint that there is on there, I would say the easier it is to lift out. And of course, the cold press paper would make it slightly more tricky because of the bumps. Mixed media is once again a breeze on this one too. So I'm going to mix some green colours here. I've just got olive and sap green, and I'm just going to do the same process on the 3 of these flowers on each of the papers, and I'm just going to be quiet while I do this so you can just watch me apply it in the same way. So with the green and now in place, we can start to think about building some detail on each of these papers. So first up, we have our hot pressed. Now, traditionally, as I said earlier on, for botanical work, hot pressed paper is probably the go-to, because you can get a really sharp pointed brush and go in for the detail. Because it's smooth, it makes the detail easier to apply with the brush here, as I'm doing. Find that I can still get the detail in very much the same way as I could working on the hot pressed paper. You can see here that I can still draw really fine lines and fine veins on the cold pressed paper. And I still think it looks much nicer on cold pressed. But again, it's my opinion, and everyone has their favourites. But I find that it gives me the depth of colour that I need. The strength of colour is so much easier to get, and yet again, with the details, it's not a problem. And you can see I'm just picking up tiny amounts of pigment that's quite dry on the palette, so it gives me full control. I must apologise for the switching in white balance on this tutorial. It was a very strange sort of overcast and then sunny day, so please forgive the switches in white balance, but hopefully it doesn't spoil the effect of the tutorial. So mixed media now, and you can see again this makes light work of applying detail. Very, very easy to do, light strokes on that paper, and just makes it super, super easy. And this is probably one of the easiest ones to add your finer detail. Very smooth paper and very easy to handle. What I'm doing is I'm going over the outside edge of the elements that we've lifted out just to enhance them. Just adding some fine detail again on all of these different papers. When you're adding your finer details towards the end of your painting, make sure that your paint is relatively dry on your palette, because you want it to be able to manipulate the paint in the way that you want to. If you have too much water, you won't have the depth of colour that you need, but more importantly, you won't have the sort of full control. You want it to be quite sticky, but not too sticky that you can't handle it. And you'll know this with experience and practice. It's something that it will feel right. So the mixed media paper, yet again, you can see how wonderful this is to blend in, even with your finer details. You can just merge those colours together. And if you find that you have any kind of hard edges, you can do the plain water glaze, as I explained earlier on. So as I continue to blend these colours together, I will just give you my sort of overall view of them once again to recap. So at the top of the page, we had our hot pressed or the smooth paper. The paper that I've used is Saunderswaterford 300 GSM, and it's a fine cotton paper, and it's not for me. Next we had the arches, which was cold press, which I absolutely adore, and the Rowney mixed media at 250 GSM.